Hey folks, and welcome to the Spring Deck Review. Sorry it's kind of late. I'm now recording from my new apartment that I've spent the last couple weeks getting moved into. It's also probably a bit more echoey than usual. I don't have my office area fully constructed just yet, so there's lots of hard surfaces and weird angles and fun little detours for sound to take. Once I have a bit more of a setup, I'll probably record a bit of facecam content for this channel though, since I'm pretty pumped to no longer be recording in a bedroom. I'll also probably start submissions for my summer deck review mid next month, since I've got some travel in September that'll prevent me from putting off the review too long. With all that said, let's get into some decks. The first deck I'm going to review is Atog's Marneus Calgar control deck. Marneus Calgar is a powerful Esper tokens commander who draws you a card whenever you create one or more tokens, and this deck is using him alongside Talrand effects that create creature tokens as a reward for casting spells. These combine to let the deck generate extra value and tokens from instants and sorceries it casts, with potentially stacking amounts of each depending on how many Talrand effects can end up in play. The non-creature spells that feed these are mostly instants with some sort of controlling effect, with 20 of these being counterspells and another 12 removing opposing permanents. There are a lot of cool higher costed options among these, such as Deny the Witch, Repel Intruders, and Silumgar's Command. This Talrand's and Instants plan is also supported by a handful of other ways to take advantage of tokens, such as Skullclamp, Urtai the Corrupted, and Ashnod's Altar. Overall, this deck is looking to build up an engine fueled by controlling instants, and eventually overwhelm opponents with tokens. So Marneus Calgar makes for a pretty neat commander choice here, and I don't actually mind it for a control deck. You get a thing to do with extra mana, and with a flash enabler, there's a lot you can do in these colors. Pairing this with a bunch of Talrand-style creatures does offer some late-game appeal, with card draw stacking on card draw to keep things moving. Still, I don't think this looks like a very functional control deck, unfortunately, and for reasons that are pretty fundamental to the core of this deck. This deck's ways of creating tokens are almost exclusively these creatures that generate tokens when you cast instants or sorceries. So you spend 9 mana to play the commander plus one of these, and then from that point forward you draw a card whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. Which is fine, but it starts to feel pretty bad when we remember that Archmage Emeritus exists, a 4-mana creature with that exact same effect. That's half of the problem. The value engines here are clunky and expensive to assemble. The other half of the issue is the interaction suite. This deck is running piles and piles of single target removal, mainly counterspells, and this just isn't really how control decks work in Commander. To keep opponents in check and outgrind them, you need to have some combination of interaction that deals with multiple things and highly efficient sources of value, with a lack in either of these being compensated for by extra of the other. So with mostly single target removal, you're really putting strain on your value engines to let you keep up, and in this case, those value engines just aren't equipped to do that. Going forward with this deck, I think you basically have two choices. If you really like this specific Marneus plus Talrand idea, you could tweak the deck's instance to be a bit goofier and more diverse, and treat this as a somewhat lower power Bracket 2 style deck. In that context, it could work, though it would still be a weak in the early game, stronger in the later game sort of experience. The other choice would be to try and identify what you find fun about this deck or the ideas behind it, and move in a different direction with those. If you want a Marneus control deck, I do think there's a way to make that feel good, but it's not going to involve a bunch of cards to generate tokens when you cast spells. Treat Marneus as your payoff, and everything else needs to enable Marneus all on their own by generating tokens, with no extra steps. Some of this can be big funny instants: Sublime Epiphany, Access Denied, Entrapment Maneuver, that sort of thing. You could also include some more reliable token engines to let the deck draw more consistently, such as Lotho, Emrakul's Messenger, Fairy Artisans, or Black Market Connections. If you wanted to make the strongest Marneus deck, you'd probably include more of these, so you can treat these as a sort of adjustment knob for the power of the deck. As a final point, if Talrand-style creatures are what you enjoy, I'd probably recommend something other than a control deck to scratch that itch. A more general Spellslinger deck with lower costed spells is going to play better with that sort of creature, even if some counterspells are still involved. The next deck I want to talk about is Magile's Dina deck, centered around Phyrexian Arena style cards. Phyrexian Arena is an enchantment that causes its controller to draw a card and lose a life on their upkeep. There are quite a lot of cards that are similar to this. Various Dark Confidant style cards, some higher mana options like the Speed Demon, and some other assorted 3-mana draw engines like Requiem Monolith and Ayara First of Locthwain. All of these draw engines are paired with Dina, a 2-mana commander that drains each opponent whenever you gain life. And this might be an odd choice at first, but it makes more sense if you think about it. Phyrexian Arena style cards are taxing on a player's life total, and they're draw engines rather than a type of cards that puts pressure on opponents. So a commander that encourages life gain by having it drain opponents kind of deals with these two problems at the same time. To go with this, there are 23 total cards that gain life in this deck, with most of them being smaller scale, but a handful such as Blood Artist and Essence Warden having potential to create quite a lot of Dina triggers. These do require creatures to be entering and leaving the board, so there are 8 token generators here, though 5 of these are also in the 23 life gain cards I mentioned earlier. This is a Dina deck, so pests make sense. To help in finishing off opponents, this deck also runs Starscape Cleric and Sanguine Bond as alternate Dina-style cards. To start with, I do appreciate running as many Phyrexian Arena-style cards as possible, and I also just like the idea of getting excited whenever the turn gets back to me because I'm about to resolve 57 upkeep triggers. Dina also feels good as a win plan for this sort of deck in a Bracket 2 context, though I will say that this deck seems like it could create some seriously long games, with it being a very slow deck that draws a lot of cards and has both 6 board wipes and 6 fogs. I don't know that that's my cup of tea, but to each their own. My bigger issue here is the vibes issue, which is that this deck doesn't really feel all that cohesive. The life gain and Phyrexian Arena elements just don't feel all that tied together. Several of your most potent life gain cards, such as Virulent Emissary and Zulaport Cutthroat, require creatures entering or leaving on your side of the board, but this deck only has 19 creatures and 8 other cards that generate creature tokens, and this just isn't going to be creating a reliable stream of life gain. The benefit of a deck centered around Phyrexian Arena is that you can make pretty much any plan for winning work eventually, given enough time, but this seems like it could take a while to turn into significant amounts of life gain for you and life loss for opponents. So what's my suggestion for this? If you stick with the tokens plan, I think Bitter Blossom and Bitter Bloom Bearer are very obvious choices for pulling this deck into a state of greater cohesion. These fit your theme of things happening on your upkeep that cause you to lose 1 life, and they also create tokens that work for your cards that like tokens. These are on the stronger side, but they're incremental enough that I don't think these should cause a problem for a Bracket 2 deck. Some other cards that might fit nicely into the Phyrexian Arena token sort of plan you're cultivating here might be Old Rutstein, Monarchy cards like the Courts, since you should have blockers to defend them, and Smothering Abomination as another Arena effect. If you want to pivot into a slightly different direction with your life gain, there are some options that don't tie into creatures that I think could be cool here. For a deck drawing a lot of cards, Venser's Journal, Ivory Tower, and Starving Revenant are all sweet life gain options, and Curse of Fool's Wisdom is a funny one that can be put on either an opponent or yourself, depending on how much of a gamer you're feeling like. The next deck I want to talk about is Ginger T's Jarad deck. Jarad is a commander who gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard, and who has a 3-mana activated ability that sacrifices a creature to make each opponent lose life equal to its power. This deck pairs that with a lot of creatures that have either a high base power or a power that is tied to a value like the number of creatures in graveyards. The most powerful of these can be pretty massive, with these including Lord of Extinction and Yargul and Multani, both creatures that are going to be putting opponents extremely low very quickly after being sacrificed. Along with these, the deck also has a handful of other cards that take advantage of creatures with a high power, such as Skullspore Nexus and Life's Legacy. In order to fuel the graveyard elements of this deck, there are also 16 cards that can help fill the graveyard, with most of these also serving some sort of card selection purpose to help the deck find lands and creatures. Overall, this seems like a sort of graveyard-based big creature deck with some explosive win paths via its commander. Structurally, I think this deck is working with some good ideas here. Jarad is really a finisher commander above all else, one that turns mana and abortive big creatures into dead opponents very rapidly. But the fact that Jarad himself gets buffed up by creatures in graveyard offers a bit of flexibility. In a pinch, you can always just eat Jarad himself with a Life's Legacy or another sacrifice effect, and if the command tax ever gets too high due to doing too much of this, he has an alternate way of getting him back. Beyond this, I like the cohesiveness of this deck's graveyard plan. There's a bunch of graveyard enabling, and this helps principally with the plan of killing opponents, but it also helps with a variety of other things, like recursion spells, crucible effects, and some other random use cases. With that said, there are some points of awkwardness here I think it'd be good to address a little. One of these is that some of the high-power creatures just aren't very good. Among the Lurgoyf-style creatures, Boneyard Worm and Splinterfright stand out as especially awkward choices. These have no base toughness, which makes them especially vulnerable to graveyard hate, and they only care about your own graveyard. This might feel okay in a deck with 40 to 50 creatures, but with only 33, you really need to mill quite a lot of cards before these start to hit respectable numbers. I also don't really see the vision on Jumbo Cactuar in a deck without haste, and I'm also a bit dubious on Daemogoth Woe Eater. These might feel better in a deck with more reanimation spells, but here the rate you're paying just doesn't seem likely to feel good in most situations, even if the potential is high. Beyond these initial observations, Ginger Tea mentioned that this deck seems to feel a bit tight on space and difficult to balance the ratios of, and I have a handful of ideas for solving this. For one, I think getting some larger scale draw in here can help cut through some of the issues this deck is having, since drawing a large number of cards both gives access to more tools and gives an opportunity to discard to hand size and feed the graveyard. Disciple of Fraelis and Sussur Secundi are a couple easy options that slot into the mana base. Greater Good would be perhaps the strongest option available of this type, and Season of Gathering is a very high utility pickup for a deck that wouldn't mind a bit more to deal with non-creature permanents. Part of the reason I like these is something I alluded to earlier. Jarad himself can be sacrificed, so this deck basically always has access to a Lurgoyf creature in a pinch. That might not be the preferred play path, but it's good as an option to keep on the table. You could also consider some mana options in this realm as well, such as Traverse the Outlands or Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, but whether or not these are necessary could depend on where exactly this deck is hitting hurdles. A final thing that could help out here is making some tweaks to let this deck mill more comfortably. One of these would be trying to transition non-creature spells into creatures, since a higher proportion of creatures makes all of the deck's mill more efficient for goyf purposes. The other thing would be adding mill cards that perform other tasks, Malevolent Rumble or Molt Tender for a bit of mana, and Six or Seed Ship Brood Tender as recursion options. These would just add a bit of extra flexibility. The next deck I want to talk about is Chase's Mardu Siegebreaker Hidden Commander deck. The official commander of the deck is Malik, Grim Manipulator, a creature that removes a creature or two in a roundabout way on ETB. And this guy was chosen as the commander because the hidden commander is one that's great at repeating ETBs. Mardu Siegebreaker is a 4-mana 4/4 creature with Death Touch and Haste, who exiled a creature you control when it enters. Then, when it attacks, it creates a token copy of the exiled creature for each opponent, with those copies getting sacrificed at end of turn. Naturally, this is paired with a whole bunch of creatures who have either a useful ETB or on-death effect, meaning that the deck can assemble an engine of some sort pretty easily once it has access to Mardu Siegebreaker. The deck runs 5 tutors in order to find Mardu Siegebreaker, and if it gets removed, there are a whole bunch of reanimation spells that can bring the Siegebreaker right back out again. As an added layer of redundancy, the deck also runs 7 other cards for purposes of repeating ETBs and or securing death triggers multiple times, which is nice for when Mardu Siegebreaker isn't out. Overall, this deck looks to be a grindy, controlling deck that intends to whittle down opponents while deploying big threats, though there is at least one combo in the deck I noticed. Chase mentioned being open to changing a lot about the deck, including the commander, in order to best build around Mardu Siegebreaker, and while I'll explore the command zone in a bit, I want to first evaluate the deck in its current form. In general, it looks pretty fun. The cards here tie together in a lot of interesting ways, and there are some cards like Sneak Attack, Key to the City, and Flesh Writher that fit beautifully here and contribute a ton of spice. I can tell a lot of thought has been put into mitigating all the possible issues Mardu Siegebreaker could run into, and I enjoy that. Still, there are a few structural issues I note here that could be worth thinking about. First of all, this deck has quite a lot of cards that have some sort of reanimation attached, which makes sense for getting Mardu Siegebreaker back out, but there's not much here for actually getting cards into the graveyard. A few sources of discard, a couple options for sacrificing, and a couple cards that tutor to the graveyard, but not enough to make the current count of 13 cards with some sort of reanimation attached feel justified in my mind. This is further compounded by the fact that this deck has very little conventional card draw at all. There are a lot of ways this deck can assemble an engine that might go value positive, particularly a removal engine, and there are a handful of tutors here, but this just doesn't seem likely to be enough. I imagine this deck is pretty likely to run into soft stallouts, where it has something it's doing with its turns, but where it's only seeing one new card from its library each turn, and just kind of spinning its wheels. I personally would want at least 4 or 5 more pieces of filtering or card draw here, and you could even pick something that loots like Jaxus or Tursa to help fill your graveyard as well. If you were to keep the current commander, I also don't think you need the amount of creature removal you're currently running, which could be one option to free up deck space. That brings us to a different question though. Is Malik the right choice for commander? Chase mentioned Celeste, and that does seem like a nice pick if you want to basically fully remedy the graveyard feeding issue, though it will get less effective as filtering the fewer cards you have in hand. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty lateral move. Do it if you like. Beyond her, another option could be Ishin, 2 Heavens as 1. This card would be a straightforward amplifier for Mardu Siegebreaker, and it struck me as a really obvious choice at first, as something that really dials up the scale of the Siegebreaker game plan. However, it does kind of clash with the game plan in some other ways, since Mardu Siegebreaker wants to be working alongside ETB and on-death triggers, rather than on-attack triggers with which it non-bows. A couple final options you could consider would be Kalia Zenith Seeker if you wanted to dial in harder on the big creature options, or Extus if you wanted a choice between easier recursion and a removal option that utilizes the tokens that Mardu Siegebreaker makes on the second main phase. Both of these seem fun, but I don't know that any of the last three seem any better than what you're working with right now. They're just some alternatives if you want to spice things up. The next deck I want to talk about is David's Bracket 4 Iname Death Aspect deck, which is centered around the Capitoline Triad. Iname is a 6-mana creature with an ETB that searches your library for any number of spirit cards and deposits them into your graveyard. The Capitoline Triad is a 10-mana colorless creature that costs 1 less to cast for each historic card in your graveyard, and which has an activated ability where you can exile 30 mana worth of historic cards from your graveyard to get an emblem that makes your creatures 9/9s for the rest of the game. So, step 1 of this deck is simple. Deploy the commander to dump all the spirits from the deck into the graveyard, play the now heavily discounted Capitoline Triad, and then exile 30 mana value worth of historic spirits from the graveyard. The deck runs quite a lot of cards that help with getting this done nice and early. 6 lands that can tap for more than 1 mana, another 14 cards that are some form of ritual or fast mana piece, and 16 conventional black tutors in order to help find the Capitoline Triad and other cards. Notably, this deck also has a high general land count, likely to help it mulligan more aggressively. After a Capitoline Triad emblem is online, ideally by turn 4, that's when the other elements of this deck start to come into play. There are a bunch of spirits that can bring themselves from the graveyard to the board quite easily, which are a mostly free source of heavy pressure, and there are also tools like Songs of the Damned and Doomweaver which can generate a ton of resources at this point in the game. With these tools available and a ton of tutors to find them, this deck will be looking to bring the game to a close quickly through a mixture of different means. This is a cool game plan, and I gotta respect the drive to power it up as much as possible. I can tell a lot of effort was put into the creature base, which initially looks a little weird, but makes a lot more sense when I consider how the mana values and card types play into it. The deck's precisely 11 legendary spirits total up to 61 mana, which gives enough room to play around with for the Capitoline Triad while still leaving options in the graveyard after it. I did a bit of playtesting with the deck, and it does seem to be able to pull off its game plan on a very brisk timeline, assuming no interaction from opponents. With that in mind, David's conundrum with this deck is whether to make it feel more resilient in Bracket 4 or to tweak it down to a Bracket 3 deck. This conundrum exists because in Bracket 4, there are a couple of types of interaction opponents can deploy to really put the kibosh on what this deck is doing, with those being counterspells to nail the Capitoline Triad and Graveyard Hate essentially at any point. As far as the counterspell issue goes, I'm actually relatively optimistic about this deck's chances. Turn 3 to 4 is when you're wanting to resolve your most critical spells, and both the Commander and the Capitoline Triad are creature spells, meaning that the options for cheap or free counterspells are quite limited. You'll get blown out by a counter sometimes, but I think a bit of extra care in how you play could keep issues to a minimum. However, the Graveyard Hate issue is a much more pressing one, and one I think will naturally put a cap on this deck's ability to succeed in Bracket 4. Coming up with a counterspell for a creature on your 3rd or 4th turn is a pretty big ask for your opponents, but having sorcery speed Graveyard Hate really isn't. It's awkward, because this deck clearly wants to play in a combo-adjacent playstyle with its commander, but it's next to impossible for it to win in a single turn, so your opponents will get a chance to hate out your graveyard and potentially lock you out of the game permanently. This will be a little rough if your opponents don't know what your deck does, and once they do know what your deck does, it'll be all the easier for them to keep an eye out for their Graveyard Hate and hit you in a critical moment. So this is the biggest issue I see with the deck in its current Bracket 4 state, and I honestly don't know how solvable it is. The deck's fundamental game plan requires a lot of deck space, and while it does have a ton of tutors to offer flexibility amongst the other cards, these still need to build on something. If you fill your graveyard with Iname and then pass the turn before playing and activating the Capitoline Triad, you're kinda obviously cooked. So here I want to assume that you activate the Capitoline Triad and then get Graveyard Hated. Everything is a 9/9 for the rest of the game, but you don't have access to any of the other spirits you might have binned. If this is the case, there are still some plays, with Nested Shambler to get you a bunch of 9/9s being the best option, and Doomweaver and Osseous Stick Twister being plausible enough backup plans. I can't say I'm that impressed by these, but they do exist, and I think you could probably slot in more versions of this if you wanted. Field of the Dead would be a token engine that slots into your land base, likewise with Fountain Port and Mirex. You could also add Avenger of the Fallen as an OTK monster, and Black Market Connections as a generally flexible card that creates tokens. That's probably as good as you can do for Bracket 4 though. Always play the Capitoline-Triad immediately after Iname, and keep some compact backup plans around. Personally though, I would probably power this down to Bracket 3. That would involve cutting most of the rituals and some of the tutors, and it'd also involve finding more cards that feel useful both with an Iname graveyard and otherwise. Season of Loss is a card I like that pairs nicely with Iname, and you could also just go more heavily into a token aristocrat sort of game plan. Include token cards for Cap Triad, figure out other ways to make those tokens feel useful, that sort of thing. My Secret Commander video from about a month ago might be helpful here. The next deck I want to talk about is Hermando's Rad-focused Mothman deck. Mothman is a flying creature that gives opponents rad counters on ETB or attack, which basically cause opponents to mill and lose life sometime in the future, and Mothman also hands out +1/+1 counters to your creatures whenever cards are milled. This is a powerful pairing that makes Mothman play quite well with Proliferate, since you can proliferate both the rad counters and the +1/+1 counters. This deck follows this trend with its 21 Proliferate cards, as well as various counter-using creatures and artifacts. But where this deck differs from a lot of other Mothman decks is in running a number of extra rad counter cards as well. Some of these are pretty sweet, such as Screeching Scorchbeast and Mirelurk Queen, whereas others are also cards that exist. These cards are naturally going to drive up the total number of cards that are milled, allowing Mothman to distribute counters out to a wider board than before. There are also a couple other cards that benefit from opponents milling, namely Sir Conrad and Dreadhound. Between Life Drain, Mothman Swings, and attacks from other creatures, this deck has a variety of ways to close out the game. There are a handful of things I like about this take on Mothman. For one, I like that it has multiple paths to winning, rather than being primarily focused on the Voltron element like a lot of Mothman decks are. This doesn't necessarily make the deck stronger, but it does make it more interesting in my mind. I also like the interaction suite here. 20 cards with a lot of different types of interaction present, and most of them contributing to one of the deck's themes. The deck does manage to have a great number of cards that contribute to its synergies in one way or another, which is nice for maintaining a high density of support for the commander and the most central cards. However, this element of the deck also leaves me worried for how well things will work if Mothman or a key piece from the deck's 99 get hated out. Like, take the 21 Proliferate cards. Putting the commander aside, we're going to be happy to proliferate rocks such as Astral Cornucopia and Everflowing Chalice, as well as creatures such as Emperor of Bones, Gyre-Sage, Evolution Witness, and Fathom Mage. However, the options start getting worse pretty quick from here. Azuri? Sure, I guess we'll draw some cards. Colonian Hydra? Sure, I guess it can get out of hand a bit quicker than it would have before. You might also point out that Proliferate powers up the deck's 11 rad cards, but rad counters don't actually do very much at all without the commander in play. The deck also runs a few counter amplifiers like Hardened Scales, Corpsejack Menace, and Winding Constrictor, which adds yet another section of amplifiers to this deck that feel bad without the commander. So my biggest issue with this deck is that it just looks a bit fragile, like a deck that can put on a ton of gas when it's ahead, but might fart around doing nothing if it gets behind. If you were trying to make this deck as strong as possible, you'd definitely want to cut most of the non-commander rad cards, but you probably already know that, and I do get the appeal of wanting to stack up rad counters on opponents. It's a funny mechanic. What leaving in all the rad cards does mean, though, is that we're spending a lot of deck space on amplification for the commander, and consequently, I think it'd be wise to cut some of the other amplification from this deck to make space for more smoothing and vegetables. Expansion Algorithm is pretty terrible without one of our big mana generators already juiced up. Tekethal probably shouldn't be in any deck whose commander doesn't have the word proliferate on it, and Agent Frank Horrigan just costs too much mana. Master Biomancer also strikes me as a pretty classical Winmore inclusion that should be cut ASAP, and as far as I'm concerned, Hardened Scales and Corpsejack Menace should also be on thin ice here, though as a 2-mana creature, I like Winding Constrictor a bit better. In place of some of these questionable amplifiers, I'd add resource generation, ideally stuff that is strengthened by the commander but also works well on its own. Flittering Nuisance, Benthic Biomancer, and Basking Brood-Scale are all quality low-cost creatures that can turn into monsters with some extra 1/1 counters. I also like Cathedral Acolyte and Rishkar Pima Renegade a lot as cards that can offer 1/1 counters, but which can also help in serving another task for the deck. You could probably even cut a bit of interaction for more card draw, depending on what the decks you play against look like. The biggest thing I'd be looking for with all your tweaks from here is cards that are extra useful with Mothman around, but still useful without him around. I think in principle, a deck can support some amount of Mothman-specific cards, but you've already done that with the extra rad cards, so flexibility should be the goal for the rest of the deck if you want a consistently enjoyable play experience. The next deck I want to talk about is Hipster Trickster's Lorehold Reanimator deck. Lorehold is a 5-mana creature that gives each instant and sorcery in its controller's hand Miracle for 2 colorless, and then also allows its controller to rummage on each opposing upkeep. That second line of text is likely going to be more relevant here, or at least equally relevant to the previous line, as this deck is running several cards for purposes of reanimating artifacts and enchantments. 4 cards that return all artifacts and enchantments, 1 that returns just enchantments, and 4 others that return a single non-land permanent. The next logical question is what sorts of artifacts and enchantments we're looking to reanimate, and there's 2 primary answers to that. Big beefy creatures that are also an artifact or enchantment, and expensive enchantments that amplify what the deck is currently doing. In addition to its commander, the deck has 5 other cards to help it get stuff into the graveyard, which should hopefully be enough to make sure the deck is able to do enough of that. Rounding out the deck is a decent ramp package, and a bit of both protection and interaction for opposing plays, hopefully enough to buy this deck time to get to the finish line. I find this deck concept really fun. The amount of rummaging Lorehold allows is pretty substantial if you can keep him in play, and there are a lot of high mana sorceries that recur things to be miracled. I also enjoy what a wide span of different card types this deck ends up having, and it feels appropriate to the Lorehold College to me. Still, in the widespreadedness of this game plan comes some natural challenges, and I can see how this deck might feel a little awkward at times. There are multiple elements required to make the central game plan function, and everything here costs a lot of mana unless we're miracling it. There's also not that much draw here, a rather middling amount of removal to buy time, and a fairly average total number of lands and ramp spells, all things I'd be looking for to sustain this deck to the point where it can get strong. One reason why these numbers might be a bit lower than expected, particularly the draw, is that a lot of the top-end artifacts and enchantments don't do very much in this particular deck. This is a 15-creature deck, yet 4 of our top-end enchantments and 1 of our top-end artifacts are dedicated to amplifying the power of our creatures. True Conviction just isn't that good a card if it's only affecting 1 or 2 creatures, and that seems like a very common situation for it. This deck's category ratios and inclusion of cards like this imply it to be some sort of tempo reanimator deck, but I think it makes a lot more sense if we conceptualize it as more of a proactive control deck, where we can land a powerful engine early and then spend time capitalizing on that engine. Some top-end cards I'd consider here are Wondrous Crucible, Godpharaoh's Gift, Nexus of Becoming, and Summon Knights of the Round, as all of these are cards with snowball potential that don't require nearly as much from the rest of the deck. If you wanted a bit more interaction to slow opponents, I also like Cityscape Leveler, as well as Extinguisher Battleship, since your commander is a 5/5 creature. Being able to crunch value and slow opponents better will likely give you more time to develop this deck's win cons. Alternatively, if you really do want to keep some of your creature amplification in, it'd be good to at least run the 2 enchantment animators, Opalescence and Starfield of Nyx. At least then your City on Fire itself can be clubbing your opponents in the face for triple damage. Aside from top end, I think you could also stand to tune your vegetables and setup cards as well. Witch Enchanter as an MDFC that removes something, Hourglass of the Lost as a rock with upside, and Myriad Landscape as a land that can also ramp all come to mind as ways to improve the flexibility of the deck. I also have a couple self-discard options I like here, which could replace either current self-discard or other cards. One of these is Matzalantli the Great Door, a super reliable looting source that's also not too hard to turn into a massive mana producer given this deck's even spread of card types. The other looting source I'd consider is Brass's Tunnel Grinder, which starts as a looting spell and flips into a land that helps generate advantage. The multipurpose nature of these makes them quite flexible and scalable compared to a lot of other looting options. The next deck I want to talk about is William's Toph modular deck. Toph the First Metalbender is a 4-mana creature that makes your non-token artifacts lands in addition to their other types, and has you Earthbend 2 on your end step. Earthbending gives a land 2 counters, makes it a creature, and causes it to be returned to play as a land if it's ever destroyed. And it works well with modular creatures in allowing you to build up counters over time by having them be destroyed repeatedly after they gain land status. To enable this play pattern, this deck runs 11 modular creatures along with 8 other artifact creatures that can be destinations for counters, as well as 12 non-creature, non-land artifacts. Accentuating this modular game plan are 8 cards that amplify counters, 3 sack outlets for getting those modular triggers, some landfall cards to take advantage of Toph's first line of text, and various other funky permanents such as Cauldron of Souls. Rounding out the deck is a fair bit of ramp, a moderate-sized but dense draw suite, and a small handful of removal options for slowing opponents. I love this unique take on Toph. It's a popular commander, but Metalcraft is quite the specific direction to take it in, and the appeals are there. The card is in good colors for the mechanic, and works naturally with it in a couple different ways. I also like some of the built-in flexibility here, with Tezzeret and Bright Glass Gearhulk both tutoring for low-cost artifacts, and with the deck containing a great range of options for these between Artifact Lands, Skullclamp, Haywire Might, and Zabaz. So this deck is cool, and looks generally functional. Still, when I'm looking at it, there are some things about this deck that I can see feeling a little bit disjointed. A big thing is that this is a deck I'd expect more sacrifice in, but I just don't see a lot of that here. The strengths of modular as a mechanic don't become realized until the creature with it dies, and if the deck doesn't have ways to kill off its modular creatures, I could see them kinda just sitting around and not doing much. There's also no shortage of sweet sacrifice cards available in the colors. Goblin Engineer, Scrapyard Recombiner, and Oswald Fiddlebender all come to mind as tutoring engines that can let the deck be a lot more nimble and flexible, and the first two can also be used at instant speed. Fanatical Devotion would be another outlet that comes to mind, especially if you need more protection for the commander, and Filigree Vector would be a counter-amplifier on top of being a source of sacrifice. All of this sacrifice stuff works well with the commander's second line of text, but you could also add a bit more recursion if you wanted the deck to work better without the commander. Throw an Icetail Explorer in there, a Scrap Trawler, a Serenth Steelseeker, maybe a Teshar, and suddenly you're cooking up an engine that doesn't even need Toph to function. The other thing I might look at for this deck is getting a bit more removal in here. This deck has pretty large-scale draw options, so I'd be okay if the number was a bit smaller, but 3 single-target options and 2 board wipes just isn't enough to be reliably available. Requisition Raid and Collective Resistance are solid modal options you could consider, and even just an Organic Extinction might be a welcome inclusion. I also imagine more lands and early filtering could help the deck stall out less before hitting its major draw, but I don't know how it's been feeling in practice, so that's your call to make. In terms of cuts, I don't think Panharmonicon does enough here to warrant inclusion. It seems like it's mainly here to pump up the landfall plan, but including extra cards to promote that plan seems a bit odd to me. I like Lotus Cobra, Feldar Retreat, and Tireless Provisioner, but Morog feels like a card that'll either feel useless or basically win the game all on its own, which doesn't seem like a great space for a card to live in. Traveling Chocobo is another amplifier to landfall, and while being able to play lands off the top is far from bad, it still feels a bit odd here. The same goes for Entish Restoration and Planar Engineering, ramp spells that are fine, but not particularly great here without one of the 4 landfall cards in play. Personally, I'd give a bit of thought to what you're finding enjoyable about this deck, because I can imagine a more landfall-heavy version of Toph artifacts working and being a lot of fun, but the stuff required for that is likely going to be competing for scarce deck space if it's paired with the modular shell. The next deck I want to talk about is D-Many's Momo Friendly Flyer deck. Momo is a 1-mana 1/1 with flying that gives a mana discount on your first flying creature each turn, and that also gets +1/+1 until end of turn whenever another flyer enters under your control. Naturally, this is paired with 29 flying creatures, with 12 of those being 3 mana for curve-out purposes. These creatures perform a variety of different functions, from buffing your board to removing things to reanimating things. A few of these are Skyfisher-style cards, creatures that bounce one of your permanents on ETB, and these can work for both pumping up Momo and for repeating ETBs. This deck also runs several sagas, so these can work for repeating earlier saga chapters as well. Outside of creatures and sagas, this deck also features several ways to pump up Momo, such as Blackblade Reforged and Armored Ascension, and there's also a decent handful of instant speed protection and removal spells. Rounding out the deck is a handful of mass recursion options, which compare with the deck's mostly 3 mana or less creatures to put it back in the game after a setback. Generally, I like this deck. 1-mana commanders are pretty rare, but Momo is nice as a card that offers both a bit of acceleration and a possible win condition, even if it's a win condition that might need a bit of help. I can also appreciate a lot of the card choices amongst the flyers. Sinu is a great filtering source, Aerial Extortionist is a sweet little engine to accelerate out a turn early, and Guardian Scale Lord plays nicely alongside Momo to consistently reanimate a 3-drop at minimum. The interaction base of this deck is also quite broad and diverse, with good access to graveyard hate, board wipes, protection, and removal for various types of permanent. So broadly, I like the look of this deck. With that said, one concern that does come to my mind looking at the deck is that the card quality isn't very high, or at least the density of stuff that cards here do. There are 6 options for repeating ETBs, but none of them are that efficient for that purpose, or much of any other purpose aside from Appa being a nice protection spell. Likewise, this deck does feature ETB creatures, but most of them have very minor ETBs, drawing a card or tutoring a land or so forth. D-Many mentioned that bouncing sagas was a fun play pattern with this deck, but 4 of the deck's 5 sagas have relatively small scale effects, and it feels like it shouldn't be worth the effort to bounce these with something like an Emancipation Angel. If this is a play pattern you find fun, then you should absolutely pursue it in some form, but the collective result of the different cards I've mentioned here is that a lot of this deck's cards just seem low impact, and any mana saved by Momo is being counterbalanced by other plays requiring kind of a lot of mana to do anything. What I just laid out isn't necessarily a problem, and will mainly be felt in the power level of this deck rather than it being consistent or enjoyable to play. If the power level feels okay, then no need to change things, but D-Many did mention struggling to beat down opponents, so I can shift my focus to offering ideas to combat that. If you need specifically beatdown tools, Sigarda's Vanguard is pretty nice, and you could also consider Zerium and Sunscorch Regent as cards that are different types of beefy. You could also grab some more equipments and dip further into that with a card like Armored Skyhunter as a great engine to get into play on turn 3, and there are other creatures that can fit into this as well, such as Starnheim Courser and Delivery Moogle. Speaking of engines, stronger card draw options might help the deck sustain itself better and keep up the pressure. For one, Firemane Commando is a great flying creature that's now relatively inexpensive due to a precon reprint. A lot of the other white draw options out there tend to be pretty pricey, but you could always go for a Wojek Investigator or a Horn of the Mark. I could also see a bit of recursion being nice, such as Sarah Paragon or Jackdaw Savior, though these could also feel a little weak depending on the game state. Beyond that, I also just like Cartographer's Hawk for ramp and Windborne Muse for defense, personally. I don't know if those are things you strongly need, but the solutions are out there. The final deck I want to talk about is Helium 64's Kykar Zephyr Awakener deck. Kykar is a 4-mana commander that gives a choice between blinking a creature and creating a spirit token whenever its controller casts a non-creature spell. In this deck, the blinking option seems like the main one that's going to be used, and this deck has a variety of different options with it. There are 17 creatures with desirable ETBs to repeat, with the majority of these being wizards that can be fetched with the deck's 2 wizard cycling cards as well. Among these wizards, the 3 Archaeomancer-style cards stand out as the most pivotal pieces, since these can pair with Kykar to repeat an instant spell on each turn as long as mana permits. There are lots of cards that could be nice to repeat this way, from counterspells to removal spells to filtering spells, but the most important 3 are Holy Day, Silence, and Orim's Chant. That last card is a combination of a fog and a silence, and with access to 6 white mana, this can allow full uptime on preventing opponents from attacking or casting spells at sorcery speed, since each upkeep will see Orim's Chant being replayed and then blinking an Archaeomancer, which can grab back the chant before the next upkeep. This sort of soft lock can be assembled with the help of Micromancer, as well as the aforementioned wizard cycling cards. For fully closing out games, the deck has a Docent of Perfection to help create a terrifying flying board, as well as Approach of the Second Sun as a guaranteed non-creature option. This deck looks pretty decently built. The plan for taking control of the game makes sense. The interaction suite is still quite wide and flexible outside of that, and the deck seems perfectly capable of having a mixture of blockers and defensive tools to keep its life total up. One quirk of this deck is that there are no artifacts or enchantments whatsoever, which also means basically no mana ramp in this case. But the deck's instant cards are very low cost to help it have a way to trigger Kykar at the ready, even at low amounts of mana. Not only this, but having all the critical parts of the deck work with the wizard cycling package, the Archaeomancers, the Micromancer, the Stalling Creatures, a Wincon, all of this lets the deck be especially fluid, since wizard cycling is instant speed and doesn't count as a spell. All of these features carve out a really unique identity for this deck in my mind, being a control deck of sorts, but one that is low curved, and not really looking to crush opponents with any sort of resource advantage like a conventional control deck might. There's only one board wipe present, which could be fine if you can get a defensive lock down pretty quickly and keep it there, though I do wonder if a time wipe or a Cyclone Summoner could also feel good if that plan isn't a 100% success. Maybe even a Disciple of Kalis Nin if you want to get real saucy. Kykar does let you dodge board wipes with your creatures, and I can imagine it being fun to take advantage of that. Anyway, if you are sticking with the lower to the ground version of this, I also wonder if it might make sense to swap out some of the more conventional control value sources like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and Sphinx's Revelation for some lower costed options like Spellseeker, Recruiter of the Guard, Watcher for Tomorrow, or Stock Up. These could also be worthwhile to replace some of the more filler cards in my mind as well, such as Lightstall Inquisitor, Cloud Conceer, and Azorius Charm. The biggest thing Helium 64 was looking for with this deck was a different win con. Currently, the deck is running Docent of Perfection as its Wizard Beatdown win con and Approach of the Second Sun as its higher caliber option for ending the game. Having a couple different styles of win con is nice for a deck like this, though it sounded like Helium64 didn't find Approach of the Second Sun all that interesting, understandably, and it is also nice just to have a larger number of options in general. So the first thing that comes to my mind is Agent of Treachery. This is a pretty classic snowballing win con for a blink-oriented control deck, and I could see it putting in a ton of work here. Another option that has a wizard type and could fit more of a hybrid role is Jadzi, Steward of Fate. This can offer a bunch of filtering earlier in the game, and then a place to dump mana later in the game. I will say it's a dramatically better win con if you have a flash enabler to let you dump all your excess mana into it right before your turn, so that could be something to keep in mind. As a final idea, I think it could help just have a bit more utility baked into the land base. Having the ability to activate a War Room or a Terrain Generator on a turn an instant wasn't needed seems like it could be pretty helpful, and the same goes for Myriad Landscape or Windbrisk Kites if you don't mind a tap land. Those are the reviews. Thanks for watching and have yourself a lovely day.